everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. As promised, today we have our interview with Carl Chung, who is the brains behind the Airsoft Innovations. This interview was recorded over a Zoom call, so the audio quality won't be quite as good as we're accustomed to, but hopefully you'll bear with us and you enjoy the show. So without further ado, here you go. So guys, before we introduce Carl, I just want to take a second to first say that we weren't sponsored by Airsoft Innovations for this interview, and we have no relationship with them whatsoever. However, we are a huge fan of their products. I know Pat as well has been using their propane adapters for as long as we've been playing Airsoft, and we've been using their tornado grenades as long as they've been on the market. So we're really excited to have a chance to talk to the guy who has whose products have really helped up our Airsoft game. So Carl, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So when Pat and I were thinking about what we might have a conversation with you about, we thought back to when we first started. And I think back about 2006 when I started playing. And I'm pretty sure even back then, I probably had one of your propane adapters at the time, one of the metal ones, if I remember correctly. How is it that you got into manufacturing Airsoft products? Did you have a mechanical design background?
Well, I was going to school at University of Toronto for mechanical engineering. So I'm trained as a mechanical engineer. And I'd just gotten to Airsoft around then. And the propane adapter is a bit of a serendipitous discovery. In Canada at the time, green gas was really expensive. It could be up to like $50 a can. And it was so expensive that we'd love our pistols, but we barely shot them because gas was so expensive. Mm-hmm. And it was hard to get. So I was taking a class in thermodynamics, which you spend a big chunk of time in thermodynamics on refrigerants, which spends a lot of time on liquid gas systems. So systems that you can evaporate liquid to provide pressure. And I just cracked open my textbook just to see what else performs like green gas that I might be able to get more easily. So originally I started using airbrush propellant. So I made a small adapter that went on to an airbrush can, and it turned out that can was filled with R22, which wasn't the same compound as what was typical with green gas. I noticed it provided a higher pressure, and it had better cold weather performance. People were wondering how come I was using my gas gun in the winter. Mm-hmm. I was the only guy who was able to shoot, so I was using R22. And it had other implications. I had to change a lot of seals in my guns because the neoprene seals didn't like the R22. And then I later discovered that R22 was ozone depleting. So I decided I really needed something else because I couldn't conscionably keep shooting ozone depleting gas, even though it was legal at the time. I figured it was slated to be phased out by 2000 for aerosol release. So I moved on to propane. And I moved on to propane basically by looking at green gas first. My first discovery was it was incredibly flammable. Yeah, and then I stuck a pressure gauge on a can, and I measured its pressure from my freezer, like a temperature I could measure, and then I measured the pressure of the can in the fridge, and then at room temperature. So I got 3 temperature pressure points, and then I went to school and looked at various gases' saturation pressures, and then I figured out that propane was bang on all 3 pressure temperature points. So I started with, it's really flammable. Yeah. It's got the same pressure performance at 3 points. And then I did another experiment where I measured the density of the gas at room temperature and atmospheric pressure, and I got within 2% of the density of propane. So I figured, this stuff probably is propane. Mm-hmm. And that's where the adapter comes from. The first adapters were made from propane torch parts. So I went to the hardware store and got 2 propane torches and just ripped them apart and attacked them with the Dremel. And I made my first adapters, like 2 adapters out of modified torch parts.
That's awesome. And I remember really cool, some of the initial conversations on Airsoft Canada on the forums with people talking about green gas is propane. Like that was the big thing. And even it's so interesting to us, at least to me today, we still had those conversations with people at the airsoft field being like, oh, well, my gun runs off green gas, so I don't know if it'll run on propane. And we're like, it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing.
It's the power of marketing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You say two things aren't the same thing when they really are very similar. If you have a branded name like green gas, it's apparently not propane then.
And it just doesn't smell as bad, but you sort of get used to the smell, right? So
yeah. Well, to be fair, there are brands of green gas which are mixed propane butane blends.
Really?
Yeah, like lower pressure gases, they'll put some butane into it to reduce its pressure. If you were running like Japanese guns that are primarily plastic, you may not want to hit them so hard. So some blenders will stick some butane in it.
Okay, cool.
Players saw me filling my guns from a Coleman can, and they're asking, Carl, what the heck are you doing, man? That you're gonna blow your gun up. I said, no, it's the same stuff. And then they noticed I was shooting my pistols a lot because propane cans were $2 a can.
Yeah.
Which was completely
totally
free. I mean, that's cheap.
Yeah. I mean, for the amount that we shoot our pistols, I mean, I haven't bought a new propane canister in a long time and I'm still fine, every game going, filling up my gun and my grenades. And actually, this is a pretty good segue because, again, when I was looking at when we first started playing Airsoft, one of the things that we always thought about was, if I'm going to go in that room, I'd like to have a grenade. But at the time, in 2006, when I first started, there weren't really any good commercially available, reusable Airsoft grenades. And I specifically remember the thread that you started on Airsoft Canada saying, you know what, guys, I'm going to make a good reusable Airsoft grenade.
I remember how excited he was.
Yeah.
I didn't play Airsoft. That year, I didn't play Airsoft. The next year, I was like, oh, man, gimme.
So from your perspective, why do you think it would have taken so long for someone to come up with like a reusable grenade like the Tornado?
I've asked myself that question. Actually, every time I have what I hope is a bright idea, I find myself scratching my head wondering, how come I haven't seen it yet? Because sometimes, most of the really great ideas have been exploited. So the unobvious ones, what I see is a real epiphany either comes way to left field and you're not prepared for it, or it initially looks like a bad idea. If it initially looks like a bad idea, nobody wants to try it.
That's right, yeah.
The Tornado 1 is one of the ideas that comes out of left field. The propane adapter, I'd say, is one of the second class of epiphanies. It looks like a bad idea initially. But as you discover what you've already been using, green gas, you're like, oh, wait a minute, we've already been doing this. It's not actually a bad idea. It's just we never realized what we were already doing.
I gotta say, I have this immediate image of you sitting there going like, all right, I've got these blowtorch parts. Am I going to explode myself today?
Well, there's a certain kind of risk involved every time you do something new. Every time I'm playing with a new design concept or I'm testing a new kind of gun breech, I have to be a lot more careful because I'm working with a piece of junk, which is typically way easier to ND with than a finished product.
Yeah, fair enough.
Prototypes are much more dangerous to mess with, so I have to approach testing carefully with them.
What were some of the initial hurdles that you had when you were developing the Tornado 1?
I'd say the first hurdle was getting over the distraction of how to shoot BBs in many directions. It seemed to be at the beginning with hand grenades, like the Zoxna, and there have been a few others with many barrels pointing in many directions. It's that's the way you should achieve coverage. If you want spread, you need lots of barrels pointing in all the directions. And if I remember my high school physics at the time, saying work or energy delivered to a projectile is force times distance. So if I use gas pressure to push on a bunch of BBs, that's like my force is based on the pressure. The distance is the length of the barrel. So as soon as you try to make a grenade with a gazillion holes pointing in all directions, you can't have a barrel of any considerable length because then you're throwing something that's like the size of a watermelon with barrels pointing in all directions. So while everybody was thinking, how do I put lots of holes pointing in lots of directions, I immediately shot that idea down, realizing that lots of barrels pointing in lots of directions would never give me very much energy in the projectile. So I thought, all right, this is a very kind of direct kind of invention. It's like, if I can't have lots of little barrels pointing in all directions, I need a long barrel, or lots of long barrels pointing in all directions.
I feel you've just given me a brand new insight into why running like propane in the 203 launcher grenades doesn't work super well.
Yeah, you're dividing your gas amongst all those barrels, and you're trying to accelerate all those projectiles at the same time, which is actually the epiphany for Cyclone. So I was thinking, well, the only way I can have I must have a long barrel. That's what I assumed at that point. I had to have a long barrel, or at least one long barrel. But then I needed to get that barrel to point all over the place while the grenade discharged. So I was thinking, well, how do I make a doohickey with a long barrel that spins around like a playground fight with a kid with his arms outstretched spinning? So spinning might do it, right? If I can make a device with a long barrel that's spun, then I might be able to get coverage. And I can't really have one long straight barrel, because that would be weird. It'd be like throwing a pistol into a room that spins and breakdances in your room. So I thought, well, I can have a curved barrel. So I curved the barrel. The BB exited on tangent to the body of the grenade, so that's where I got my spin. And then I basically wound two barrels around each other, kind of like a DNA helix. And at the end of each barrel is a little ramp, one pointing up, one pointing down. So it describes two cones as the grenade fires. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I can't find my first working proof of concept of the tornado grenade, because I couldn't make the form of plastic initially for prototyping. It's kind of beyond my machining abilities to machine those clamshell halves, as most of people have seen in the tornado. Mm-hmm. So the prototype actually had a curved piece of tubing, two little flexible vinyl tubes that were wrapped around the valve body. Mm-hmm. And when the grenade fired, the tubes would unfurl and actually just spaghetti everywhere.
So you made a wacky arm flailing inflatable tube-man grenade.
Yeah, we called it the tentacle nade.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So the tubes I would rubber band to the body just to keep it compact. And the timer mechanism initially was hydraulic. It needed a slug of water, which it would pee out as a time base. So you pull the pin, it would start peeing water, and then you throw the thing, and then when it went off, the tubes would just unfurl and the thing would spin and shoot everywhere. It was fairly unmanufacturable. What it was, I don't call it a prototype. I call it a proof of concept. And because it worked, I actually call it a failed disproof of concept. Because really, when I build prototypes, it's to figure out where I'm wrong. So if the thing actually works and I'm not wrong, I'm like, ooh, I failed to find problems. So I call it a failed disproof. But
that's a pleasant surprise, right?
Exactly. I'm actually a very pessimistic designer, as it turns out.
So you talked about how, you had to figure out how to get it to spin and do all this stuff. But in addition to that, I also remember there was a period where you were sort of consulting with the community as well to figure out, like, what were some features that the grenade should have. Like, so, we talk about it being reusable and stuff, but from your perspective, what were some must-have features that you wanted on the grenade and in the sort of a final design?
Well, first off, I wanted a reliable timer, or at least a timer which would always go off at some, short-ish amount of time. At the time, most of the grenade products that offered a timer, actually they all offered a timer, their timers were extremely inconsistent. And I took them apart, and I kind of realized what the real problem was. Those products were relying on friction as a time base. So basically, a pin or some part, which would be bared upon by a screw and a piece of rubber, would slide on this pin, and the pin would slowly move until the valve could change state and would fire. And the problem with friction is it's very hard to get consistent friction. So those mechanisms would completely lock up quite often and never fire, or maybe fire in 2 minutes. Or they would just slide really quickly and go off, just out of your hand. So with the Tornado, I realized that I really couldn't rely on friction as a time base. So I moved to what's called damping. So what I used was a fluid like water and a piston that would push on the water, and that water would squirt out of a controlled hole. So a hole of small diameter. So as that water leaked out, the piston could move slowly and then at some point suddenly change state to firing mode. So the first tornado proof of concepts, you uncorked a little hole, and with a syringe you'd put in about an ounce of water into it, and then you plug that hole. So when you pulled the pin, it would unlock the piston, it would push out that water, and then when that piston had moved sufficiently, then another port would open, dump the remaining water, and suddenly open. And
Really cool.
when we were, I was really excited I got that stupid mechanism to work. And at the time, I used to have an airsoft store. And one of our good customers was around, a guy named Colin. And I said, hey, Colin, check this out. And we blew it up. And we were very excited because it was a timing mechanism that worked. The grenade spun. It looked hilarious because of the unfurling tubes. And since there were no other customers, we just kept blowing it up as fast as we could fill it. And I'd never really done that because we were just exuberant. And then I got a misfire. And I was scratching my head like, oh my God, I discovered a problem I've never seen before. And I was trying to figure out what the heck went wrong. And then I took it apart. And a slug of ice fell out of the water chamber. We were firing the damn thing so many times, so frequently that the water charge had chilled and blocked it all up, which is an error mode I hadn't seen with my testing before.
Right.
That is awesome. Like just yeah.
Like a slushy fell out of it. Like one
of those moments of yep, should have thought of that.
Well, that's okay. That's why I say I build proof of concepts to see where I'm wrong.
I mean, it's really funny because you're saying that, and I hadn't thought about that as a potential issue. Like, we live in Newfoundland. We've played in fairly cold weather here and used your grenades in fairly cold weather and had them go off fine. But that definitely is an issue we would have run into.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't actually worried about the water freezing because we were firing that thing at such a high rate. It was kind of unreasonable. But what it did tell me was that little hole that the water came out of was not hard to plug. And that was a real problem. Because if you loaded your charge of water, say from a Camelback, and you get one coffee grind in there, you could plug that port. And the grenade, you'd have a hot grenade that's leaking very slowly, and you might take that back into the safe zone.
Ooh, yeah.
Everybody takes their goggles off.
Yeah, for sure.
So that ice, that slush-driven failure revealed a different kind of failure mode that was much more concerning to me. So at that point, I said, okay, I can't use water and a tiny hole. I need to use something that's harder to block. So I went with air eventually, and a porous plug, which is much more difficult to block.
Mm-hmm.
And ran into an entirely new host of problems doing that.
Fair enough.
But nobody saw the water timer grenade. All the tornadoes were air timer.
Except for Colin.
Except for Colin, yeah.
If you ever find it, please, post a video to YouTube.
Yeah, that'd be hilarious.
Yeah. It was funny because you see this little stream of water just fishing out the side they're like a water gun.
Awesome. So, wacky whaling arm-inflatable grenade notwithstanding, what's your favorite memory about developing it?
Oh, that one. That grenade. That grenade was a very fun project because I didn't have that much time or financial pressure bearing down on me at the moment. Because the business was actually operating fairly healthily on just adapters. So for me, I could pursue it as a bit of a fun vanity project. So I'd say that just designing it and playing around with principles and just being able to pursue how the thing worked was a lot of fun. The first reactions showing people that ridiculous tornado grenade at a field was pretty rewarding.
I'd say, yeah. How did players respond when you showed them that? Because it's kind of like seeing something you've never ever seen before, right?
First public demonstration was at a field called TAC in Toronto. I really liked that field run by Brian McKilmoyle. And there was a team there that was very friendly to me, the Ghosts. And them and their friends were the first user test space. And we stood maybe a dozen of us in a circle. And I just dropped a grenade in the middle. And everybody's just watching with intent because we hadn't seen anything. I mean, we'd seen crappy grenades do nothing. But I dropped this bizarre-looking pile of trash on the floor. And when it blew up, I think 7 or 8 of us got hit, and solidly, really a real pop. So when 8 out of 12 people in a 12-foot circle get popped and nothing's prior, everybody's like, do that again!
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember when we got the first run of grenades that we had here from you guys, it was very much like, yeah, we're just going to spend a while, more time than I care to admit, really. Just like, can we drop this in the bathtub? What'll happen?
Yeah. Yeah, when you have a fun new toy like that, I know I've got something when the users forget about the game a bit and they spend 15 minutes just blowing it up just for shits and giggles.
Totally.
But the next thing that really I found really rewarding was just hearing them going off in the field. I didn't anticipate it, but the tornado had a very characteristic sound.
Yes, definitely.
It had this kind of audible response that we weren't used to hearing. So you'd hear the shower of it going off. You'd hear a screech of somebody surprised, like, what the heck was that? And then the rattle of BBs, like this shower. And sometimes BBs would be raining down, because they went up and then over the wall you're behind.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember the atmosphere of CQB games really changing when you heard the grenades going off and being thrown. So you hear the thud of a heavy object hitting a wall and then that shower. And then everybody like, ooh, somebody just got blasted.
I know.
Yeah, for sure.
When we first got them here at one of the fields we play in, there's a fairly enclosed octagonal building, and just Phil and I tossing grenades in the windows instead of having to go inside to collect people was fantastic.
Yeah.
I really liked how that grenade changed the game insofar as it really broke up bottlenecks.
Mm-hmm.
Airsoft could get very bottlenecky without grenades, because there's spots where you can just put 3 guns on a passage, and you're just losing player after player just trying to break through them. And it's an attrition fight. But if you can huck a grenade in there, it changes that a lot.
Turns out force multipliers are a real thing.
Yeah. Whatever you can. I think what I'm always trying to do with every product I launch is change the game somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Make it more interesting.
And I definitely think that we experienced that with the tornado ones, and we experienced it with the tornado impacts as well. I think that was a big thing for us. But so it's clear, obviously, you're a tester. Like you learn from your mistakes, learn from experiences. What are some of the things that really helped you in developing? And you sort of intimated it at the start, but moving on towards the Cyclone and then eventually the Tornado 2. What are some of those lessons that you sort of are carrying forward?
The most brutal lesson I'd say I learned with the Cyclone is be careful with product overreach. The Cyclone is a product that was intended to be a launchable grenade. It was meant to be a launchable grenade and a hand throwable grenade. So to be honest, I tried to fold way too much into that product. And by nature of attempting to make it launchable, it had to fit in a 40 millimeter tube. Which caused me all sorts of space problems. Now, the funny thing about Cyclone was I was machining prototypes out of machinable materials, and they were generally going together reasonably well. But when I got injection molded material, like very similar, still acetal, my welding, like the means to join the parts together, went completely strange. And I thought I had a product, I thought I had manufacturing features that would be reliable in terms of I could reliably assemble it. And then I discovered this big can of worms that I never anticipated. So a lot of that was caused basically by attempting to miniaturize Cyclone just too much, just to fit down a tube. Mm-hmm. And I gave up on that launchable feature because when I finally got a design that was firing and pretty lightweight and what I thought was weldable, I made a dummy and I shot it out of a tube, and it just went through both sides of a cardboard box. Even though I got the product to be so light. Early Cyclone proof of concepts that were meant to be launchable were only 50 grams.
Oh, wow.
So they were the weight of a tennis ball. Loaded. And I think 20 grams of that mass was BBs and gas. So I shot a 50-gram dummy through 2 sides of a cardboard box, and the range I would achieve with that projectile was not that high. Mm-hmm. You could definitely lob the product 80 to 100 feet without a crazy steep firing angle, which I thought, okay, that's a good range for a launchable projectile. But at 50 grams, it was just too dangerous.
Yeah.
So I figured at that point there was no way I was going to be able to make something launchable because I'd have to get it under 50 grams, reusable, durable, cost effective,
Hmm.
This is starting to be a hell of a list. Yeah.
with enough range to be worth having. And it was really that range worth having that was a real killer. If you want to shoot something at a range worth having, your projectile needs to be really light. If
Yeah.
you're going to be okay not shooting a riot baton at someone.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to make it safe, for sure. And I remember some of those conversations on the Airsoft Canada forums as well, back in the day, talking about like Launchables and all this stuff. Yeah, I mean that's a totally legit reason. I think, there are some airsoft products out there that are very cool, but ultimately they are not safe. Right. I think about some like airsoft pyro grenades and stuff like that. And, if that goes off in your hand, you could very well lose your hand. So it's cool, but like, why would you want something that is potentially, we're doing this for fun, no one's earning any medals, like we definitely don't want to go down that road for sure. So I can also really appreciate from the consumer side, as a sort of as an aside, as a consumer, I can appreciate when a manufacturer will turn around and say, unfortunately we can't create this product because it is not safe. I think, as opposed to saying we're going to do it anyway. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I can't take that position because I'm in Canada and I'm within subpoena range of my markets. And as an engineer, we go through a whole traditional process at the end when you graduate that reminds you how important it is for engineers to be careful and not write bridges that collapse or release launchable products that are riot batons.
And I gotta say, had you released that, and been less responsible, I would A, own several, and B, have been someone in the head with them by now. So probably to the best.
This is an early example of a launchable grenade that I've made. This is pre-cyclone. This is a trigger strike head. So basically, this head, when it struck a target nose on, would trigger the grenade and fire out of 5 ports, which had convoluted barrels, and it would spin as it discharged. And this damn thing actually worked. I shot it into a fabric barrier because I didn't want this to get destroyed. This is all 3D printed material that I modified. But I have made firing versions of it. Just that when I started doing ballistic testing with the projectile itself, it just couldn't be made reasonable.
I have to ask, this is a little bit off script, but has 3D printing been like as big a deal for you guys in terms of prototyping stuff as I figure it would?
It has been a big deal with anything I do in injection molds. Generally, injection molded shapes can be very hard to machine. And it's not because injection molding is a process that always makes hard to machine shapes. It's just that once you've gone through the cost of making a mold, you tend to want to shoehorn as many features into that form as you can. And you might spend $60,000 on a mold. You really need to make that part worthwhile. And once you start designing with injection molding in mind, you must take advantage of all of these lower cost features that you can integrate into a part. And that starts making your machined parts insane and really hard to machine. And even worse, because of the way injection molding works, your wall thicknesses of your parts have to be fairly thin. If you have very thick wall thicknesses, they take forever to cool in the mold. And even worse, they start warping like mad. And when you start machining parts that simulate injection molded parts, they tend to get very flexible while you're machining it. I mean, it's not like that part will be more flexible than the injection molded one. It's that you can't even support the part while you're machining it. And your part kind of blows up in the vise because as you take material away, it gets too flexible, the vise lets go, and then the part just slides around.
Right.
So 3D printing has been very useful for simulating injection molded parts for me. But it's not like I can get 3D printed parts and just use them. For instance, this is a proof of concept part for the Cyclone. At the top, it has my curled barrel, a threaded element, back when I had a different idea of how to attach the timer head to it. It's got the same convoluted serpentine passage that Cyclone has. And it's not actually able to handle propane. It's made out of a material which is chemically very unstable. And even worse, it's not that strong. So if I pressurize this with propane, it just cracks and blows up like dry lasagna.
Wow.
So for me to use rapid prototyping to model something like the Cyclone, I get a part and then I clean it up, which means I start finishing surfaces that aren't accurately made, because there's always a deviation between what your design asks for and what you get. And then I start having to do stuff like glue in a stronger sleeve for it to be the pressure vessel. So I can't depend on this SLA part to be a pressure vessel, but I can make a thin-walled pressure vessel that will handle the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like rapid prototyping replaces conventional processes for me at all.
Right.
To me, it's a useful tool to add to the toolbox.
Fair
and
enough.
I use the rest of the toolbox to get me what I want.
Thanks. That's really, really cool. My experience with 3D printing is sort of limited to, printing odds and ends to like store things in. And I had really not thought about what the pressure from propane would do to that stuff though.
Or the chemical problems.
Yeah, I would never have thought of that.
This guy is SLA nylon. So this is made out of nylon particles that have been sintered together with a laser. And it's actually more chemically stable than SLA. This process is less accurate, but it's porous. So this one I could use as a pressure vessel, but I had to soak it in super glue to fill up all that porosity. So the pressure vessel in this product, in this proof of concept, this part here, this cavity here, is sealed with cyanoacrylate glue, just so it doesn't whiz out and leak. And it's sliding surfaces that my seals have to slide on is finished machined. So this SLA part has got this very powdery texture, which is not amenable to rubber seals. It's porous, so it can't hold gas initially, but I can wet it all up with super glue, let it set, and then stick it in a lathe, and then turn down my sliding surfaces to make them smooth, and then use it as a pneumatic body. So 3D printing is, I wouldn't shoot it down and say it's useless. I think it's extremely useful, and it's far more useful if you have conventional techniques at hand too.
To use in concert, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's really
awesome.
We've talked a lot about what is possible and some of the things that you've encountered and problems you've encountered. Is there a product that is sort of like, if it was guaranteed to work, is there something that you always want to try, but conceptually you're like, I don't know?
I want to make a launchable 40 millimeter grenade. I still want it, but I can't make, I can't launch a riot baton. I have no idea how to do that. I wish I could. I mean, I'd love to say, third floor left window, scene, move, and blow the room up. I've always wanted to do that.
I would have another 40 millimeter grenade launcher on the way to my house now.
Yeah. So that being said, I know that you guys just released the Tornado 2. I've seen some stuff coming out as well in the Bang 22. So what is next for you guys? What are some of the things that our listeners should be on the lookout for on the horizon?
Well, I'm continually been working on the shotgun from must be like 5 or 6 years ago. But maybe about 4 or 5 months ago, I've come upon an engine design that I finally really like. It's I've had engine. I call the generic worky bits of the gun an engine. It's a bit like the center of your car that provides all the power. I've had previous engine designs that I haven't been quite happy with. They were ballistically interesting, but they had problems like they were not very manufacturable, or they ejected shells that people didn't want to pick up, or they were just too messy for assembly. But I've finally come upon an engine design I actually really like. It's got good mechanical capability in that the performance envelope of it is nice and wide, so I can tune it for the context that we want, and it's got good, reliable operating margins. I guess what I mean by operating margins is that it's not like it barely works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
It's an engine that is made with garbage, literally, and pen springs. I'm lazy. I don't always like to wind a spring to push one apart. So I have like an assortment of pens that I just scavenge springs out of regularly. I have some valves with lighter springs in them, big lighter springs.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've got is an engine that's working with, carefully machined parts and a bunch of garbage that's actually working robustly. which means that if I'm pretty sure I can tweak it into reliable and pretty excellent, because the current piece of garbage proof of concept is working reliably. And it's performing really well. It's a real fire breather. I think it'll finally justify the shotgun category of shotguns.
Awesome.
Well, sounds a whole lot like Pat needs to start saving some money.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. We're both looking forward to it.
Well, I mean, for me personally, you've asked me what's my dream product. I've held in my heart a few holy grail products for Airsoft. And the propane adapter wasn't one of them. That was serendipity. But a working grenade that was actually worth throwing was one of them. I've always wanted a shotgun that's actually worth fielding. I've always wanted a bolt action rifle that actually justified its category. Like, it needs to outrange everything else we got. It's got to be more accurate than everything else we have. And unfortunately, it also needs to be safe at intermediate and maybe even short ranges.
Is that throwing batons problem again?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. It's very hard to get range and grouping and nice tight groups and safe at, call it 10 meters. It's really tough to do that. And I think actually the only way I could do that with a bolt action is a different type of round. A round that carries its velocity well and has a soft point that can absorb the energy of the impact, so it doesn't deliver all that energy to the target.
Yeah.
So I think if I really wanted to do it, like if you said, cost notwithstanding, I'd like to make a good sniper rifle that really, justifies fielding that.
That's
I want
a good
something
answer.
that feels like you're fielding a pellet gun.
I've often felt that, like, one of the, I guess, oddities of Airsoft was the projectile we're using. And if you could figure out a way to make, a more bullet-shaped projectile, more aerodynamic projectile work, that would be incredible.
Mm.
It's been done in the past. In Japan, they had a bullet called the Blade Bullet, which was it was aerodynamically. It was shaped to, I can't remember what they call it. It was shaped to be almost kind of like fin stabilizing, because you couldn't impart a twist very well.
Okay.
And it apparently carried its velocity well. But the problem is I think if it was effective at long range, it would be dangerous at intermediate range. And that gun disappeared because they duplicated an M700 too closely. But none of those guns made it to Canada. None of the projectiles made it to Canada. Paintball has an aspherical round. There's a company called Tiberian.
Yeah, they make the first strike rounds, I think is what they're called, right?
Yeah. They make a projectile that's got a plastic skirt on it that aerodynamically points it forward. And I think they have a barrel that's rifled so you can even impart a spin on it. And I hear in paintball, it's actually a particularly accurate round. And like, it's a particularly accurate platform.
Yeah, especially for their application in paintball. Yeah. Well, I think, Carl, even if you were to say, hang up your skates, so to speak, you've already contributed so much to the sport in terms of game-changing tools that we use, and, tools that for our money, especially when it comes to tornado, are ubiquitous, right? Like, everywhere we go, it's hard to go to an airsoft field and not see at least one of your tornadoes, which I think is a crazy cool legacy. And in that respect, I mean, that's why it was so exciting for us to get a chance to talk to you today. And we can't thank you again enough for coming on the show and sharing your stories and your knowledge and your wisdom with us,
and teaching us so much.
Yeah, and we can't wait to see what you guys come up with next.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening in to our interview with Carl Chung from Airsoft Innovations. We really appreciate you guys coming along to nerd out with us. It has been extremely fun. I'm super excited to get to see all the things he was talking about in the future. And as you can tell, we just love his products.
Yeah, so thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you next week.